p.m. Next, highlights from the 1972 Democratic National Convention.
George McGovern, the 1972 Democratic National Convention was in Miami, Florida, and you were the nominee. What were your expectations for the convention as you arrived in the city?
Well, I thought I would be nominated, but frankly, that wasn't a sure thing. Our California delegation had been challenged in a kind of a bizarre desperation move on the part of the other candidates, a situation that had all of them ganging up, from George Wallace to Shirley Chisholm, trying to block my nomination to give themselves another shot at it at the convention. If we had lost that California challenge, of course, we probably would have lost the nomination. That was the one uncertainty as I entered Miami.
And you had, how many votes did you have going in?
Well, I've forgotten the exact total, but we were a little bit short of what we needed to tie up the nomination. We had plenty of votes if we counted all of the California delegation, and under the rules it clearly stated that in the case of California, the winner got all the rules. The winner-take-all California primary was a notable institution, so that was the only thing that hung in the balance.
And Hubert Humphrey was involved, wasn't he?
Hubert Humphrey was involved. He had said going into California that he hoped to turn around the McGovern tide in California. He said, California's the big one, this is where the winner takes all, this is where we're going to win. But when he lost California, his organization helped lead the challenge to change the rules that everybody knew were the rules going into California.
And Wilbur Mills?
Wilbur Mills had been a candidate, but I think by the time we got to Miami, he had pretty much given up. Wilbur had the support of some of the business community, some of the delegates across the South, but his campaign never really caught on.
And Ed Muskie?
Ed Muskie, we had expected to be the tough guy in 1972. He was the front runner with a vengeance, all during the early polling in 71 and early 72. The first stumble there occurred in New Hampshire, and then we beat him in Wisconsin. But Ed was a very capable candidate.
Terry Sanford of North Carolina made a challenge?
Terry Sanford, a good man, one person that I highly regarded, a good governor, very much respected, especially by people interested in education. He was a good candidate.
And Shirley Chisholm, whom you already mentioned, she was the first
Shirley was,
woman.
Shirley was a credible candidate. She was one of the first women to seek the presidency, and certainly the first black woman to seek the presidency. And she had a lot of vigorous supporters in the convention and across the country.
Talk a little bit about your selection of the running mate, Thomas Eagleton. Under what circumstances, and had you to do it over again, what would you have done?
Well, I would have started much earlier, and I would have run a close check on everybody under serious consideration. But I should tell you that nobody did those things in those days. I wasn't any different from any other presidential nominee. I think you'd be amazed to know how tickets are put together in the period prior to the Eagleton problem. Up until then, candidates would wait until the last minute and then grab who was ever available. It was done without planning, it was done without careful checks, and we pretty much followed the traditional pattern. I should also tell you that the first 7 people I asked to be my running mate turned me down. That was unusual. But keep in mind, I was running against an incumbent president at the height of his power. Few people thought I had any chance to win. So one candidate after another turned me down, and we finally came to Eagleton partly because he desperately wanted the nomination, and secondly because he kept turning up on so many lists as the second choice of people. So we thought he must be pretty good if he was everybody's second choice.
Now let's talk about your speech. We're going to see it in a few minutes. The theme was Come Home America. Where'd that come from?
The Come Home America theme was one first sounded by the late Dr. Martin Luther King. He used that phrase to call America home to its ancient values, to its founding principles, to the Judeo-Christian ethic, everything that had to do with the underlying traditional values of the country. It struck a note first with my wife, who read that speech by Dr. King, and then by me, that this is what we were trying to do, to call the country back to the principles of decency and dignity and justice and peace that had made us a great country. And that was the origin of the phrase.
And how much of the speech are your words as opposed to somebody else's?
I suppose 2/3 of it are my words. I got drafts from several different people. Arthur Schlesinger, who had been a John F. Kennedy speechwriter, Adam Walensky, who had written speeches for the late Robert Kennedy, Robert Shrum, who played a key role in all of this, John Holem of my own staff, Sandy Berger, who worked for me. I took those various drafts and really put that speech in my own words. I'd say that 2/3 of it was McGovern.
And when did you complete the speech?
I completed it the day it was delivered. I was still working on it, I would say, up until 3 o'clock, maybe 4 o'clock, the day I delivered it. I sent it down to have it typed and to have it put on the teleprompter. I had never once seen that speech on the teleprompter until I walked out on the podium to deliver it later that same night.
Were you satisfied with the response you got to the speech from the delegates?
Well, the speech reaction was fantastic. The great tragedy is that it came at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Why?
It indicated the freestyle nature of that convention. Obviously, that was a dreadful mistake. I think possibly the most costly single mistake that we made in 1972, even more costly perhaps than the vice presidential selection, because it was the first thing that people saw. It was the first, or that they didn't see. It was the first opportunity for me as a junior senator from South Dakota to make an imprint on 75 or 80 million Americans who were watching the convention at 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening when I should have been giving that speech.
At the time, did you have a chance to schedule it earlier, or at least for the next day?
All we had to do was to call the national chairman, Larry O'Brien, and say, look, let's put the acceptance speech on now and hold all this other business until after I speak. If people want to go till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, fine. But let's have the acceptance speech and Senator Kennedy's introduction. Let's have that now and get it out of the way. We can let this vice presidential nominating process run all night. But for goodness sake, let's give the acceptance speech in prime time, and it would have been done. But this was a convention largely run by the delegates without too much of a strong hand from the podium, and we just followed the normal course of events and let things take their own course. A great mistake.
Speak to the vice presidential nominating process. What happened?
Well, on the nominating process, we were supposed to submit the name by 4 o'clock on the day prior to the acceptance address. And we had thought we had a good list of people. It never occurred to me that I would be turned down by all of these people on the list, beginning with Reuben Askew, the governor of Florida, ending up with Gaylord Nelson, who was the one person I asked who said, I don't want it because I think you might win, and then I'll be stuck with that damn job. Worst job in the country. Everybody else, I think, turned it down on the grounds that I had little chance of winning. But Senator Eagleton was out campaigning among the delegates for the vice presidency. He had told the press he was interested. I thought he was a good man. He is a good man. A lot of other senators recommended him to me. None of us knew anything about this history of mental illness until several days after the convention adjourned.
But the speeches, what is it that delayed the speech?
What delayed the speech was that when we opened the vice presidential nominating process, everybody and his brother got nominated. If you look at the pages of the proceedings, the vice presidential nominations took 38 pages as over against 5 pages for my acceptance address, which should have been the centerpiece of that final session. In other words, we spent 8 times as many minutes or hours, if you please, fooling around with vice presidential nominations as we did on the acceptance speech.
Did you ever get any indications as to how many Americans actually saw your speech delivered at 3 in the morning?
I was told that about 2.5 or 3 million people saw it.
What do you think you would have had it been on a prime time?
Probably 80 million, something like that. That was a popular convention. There was a lot of interest in it. People were watching it all across the country. And I'm convinced if they had seen me at 9:30 or 10 o'clock deliver that speech, which was the best speech I ever gave in my life, I think it would have changed the outcome of the election. We might not have won, but it would have set off favorable comment from coast to coast in this country that might have enabled us to survive the Eagleton crisis a week later.
Well, George McGovern, 16 years later, we're going to put it on a different time. And thank you for offering your perspective on the convention and giving us this introduction as we show our audience your acceptance speech from 1972.
I'm going to be glad to see it in prime time.